sentenced for the same crime, except he wasn't sentenced to death. He is to receive life imprisonment. Both of them are to have all their personal assets seized. So there's a question mark there as to whether or not, why there is this sort of difference in the punishment between the two individuals. The only sort of distinction that we can see was that Xu was responsible for the purchase of this equipment and raw material, as I say, and otherwise, as far as we understand, the drug was manufactured in Wen's home and then was stored in Xu's residence. That's the only difference that we can see for this time being. So certainly there's going to be some people, no doubt, questioning whether or not Xu's Canadian nationality had any part to play in what is a vastly different punishment that he received. And of course, this raises a lot of alarm bells, no doubt, because it is the third Canadian national to be sentenced to death since the two Michaels were detained in China, although China has said that drug charges, drug-related crimes in China are incredibly serious. The courts dealt with this independently, and the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry, Wang Wenbin, said that he didn't think that it would harm relations between China and Canada in any way.
Freelance reporter Patrick Falk in Beijing.
Now get a $59.99 full synthetic oil change. Request your appointment today at Midas.com.
The last few months have helped us see just how connected we all are. And as we look at the big picture, it just might remind us how amazing freedom really is.
I wonder if she's ever gonna pop the question.
I think she's gonna ask me to marry her.
I better ask her, because I've got better taste.
I should ask her. I've got much better taste.
Together, we're making a difference to stop the spread of COVID-19. If you are worried you may have been exposed to the virus, get tested, practice physical distancing, and wash your hands frequently. To find out more, visit ontario.ca/coronavirus.
International aid is now coming into Beirut after yesterday's deadly explosion, and with some of the first planes of humanitarian aid landing from places like Russia, Qatar, and Greece, the World Health Organization says a plane from the United Arab Emirates carrying 20 tons of medical supplies is also now on the ground there. The WHO says the emergency aid is enough to carry out 1,000 operations and treat another 1,000 trauma patients. Now, those medical supplies are desperately needed as doctors struggle to keep up with overwhelming demand. But the country's healthcare system was already facing major challenges. Now, several hospitals have been destroyed and the situation is being described as dire. Our Natasha Fattah is on this story for us. So, Natasha, take us through all these challenges.
Hannah, there is so much for the healthcare system in Lebanon to deal with that it was already dealing with before the blast happened on Tuesday. So you have an economic crisis, you have political instability, you have mass protests, and you have a global pandemic with a surge of cases happening in the country. And Beirut was really the center of that. Add to this unbelievable explosion, unprecedented happens. More than 140 people now confirmed dead, but the real crisis for the healthcare facilities is the thousands and thousands who have been badly wounded and injured and who still need treatment. Hospitals have been destroyed. We know that healthcare workers were killed in the blast, at least 5 nurses, according to the nurses union. And we know patients in those hospitals were killed, and those who survived in those badly damaged hospitals had to be transferred over to other locations. The buildings that were still standing that were hospitals or medical centers, they had to turn people away because they were just completely exhausted. They did not have the facility, the space, the staff, or even the security to treat them. So you've got this compounding situation taking place, and then you've still got people trying to be as resourceful as possible. The St. George Hospital in Beirut, which is about 2 kilometers away from where the blast took place, they said, okay, the building is standing, but it's not safe, so get everything out onto the street. They got the hospital, the equipment, the beds, and then the patients, everyone being treated out in the middle of the street. Remember, as ambulances are driving by, people are panicking, destruction all around them, and yet their responsibility as healthcare workers goes on. So it's under this tremendous amount of pressure that all of this is happening. And remember that many of the doctors and nurses and first responders also lost loved ones, also suffered injuries, but they still had to do their work. And our colleagues at CBC Radio last night spoke to a doctor who was in one of those situations. Have a listen to him.
We have the economic crisis, and with COVID-19 infection hitting the country, and with this explosion, it's terrible what's happening in Lebanon. Seeing children, newborn children, carried by their moms and fathers. And it's horrifying, it's nightmare.
And we've heard from several doctors, including one that said in his decades of service as a doctor, he's never experienced anything like this. And another one saying that between COVID-19, the blast, and what is surely to come in terms of a heightened food crisis and people starving, the country is just not ready, and they're going to be increasingly dependent on foreign aid, which, as you've been reporting, Hannah, is slowly trickling into the country.
There's so much tragedy there, but we're also hearing some stories of hope. Tell us some of that.
Well, it's a story of hope, but it's also, I mean, if you believe in such a thing, it's a miracle. It's incredible what happened. As the blast was hitting, this woman, Emmanuelle Canasser, she was at the hospital ready to give birth, and then the explosion happens, the windows shatter, and yet she manages to continue her labor, and the doctors and nurses continue to do their work. Her husband, Edmund, was there, and he photographed the whole thing, he documented it. So the lights go out, there's complete panic and chaos, and yet nevertheless, their son George is born happy, healthy. He doesn't know what's going on. The family is completely relieved. And this is the sort of story people in Beirut are holding on to say, look, despite all the chaos around us, we still have a responsibility to take care of each other. And certainly that was an example of that. And Edmund posted on social media in the voice of his son, George, basically thanking the doctors and nurses for bringing him into this world. He said, and this is the voice of newborn George, "Thank you for bringing me safely into this world. I hope I can pay you back someday." So it's a small story. It's so tiny, as is the baby, in relation to the pain and suffering that is so tremendous in Lebanon. But it's those little kernels of joy and hope and goodwill that really keep a society going. And certainly that's what we're hearing from folks on the ground and people right around the world who are demonstrating solidarity with the people of Lebanon.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story too. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Now, Canada has so far committed $5 million in emergency aid to help with the aftermath of that blast in Beirut. The Canadian government and the French president have made it clear that aid money will not go into the hands of the Lebanese government. So for more on that part of the story, I want to turn to Ruby Dagger. She's a professor of international development at the University of Ottawa. Ms. Dagger, thank you for joining us on the program. Let's start first. Talk about those concerns about directing aid in the right direction.
Sure. When we talk about humanitarian aid, normally when any country that is in post-conflict or deemed developing, we normally talk about having to go through the state because then we undermine the capacity of the state. But given the situation in Lebanon actually right now, and given that there was a social movement that was really trying to undo a lot of the damage that was being done and actually request a change, and they were moving forward and they were moving the movement, the momentum forward, going again and working through the state right now is a very difficult pill to swallow because it again empowers the same leaders that these people are trying to remove, the same leaders who have been completely ineffective in leading Lebanon. So avoiding the government, at least for now, and a state that is deemed not only corrupt but also illegitimate, and a government that is also deemed illegitimate, I think is the best move for now.
So is there any chance that if it went through the state or the government that the money would actually make it to where it wants to go, or is it just we're not even going to take that risk?
There will be a chance that it will make it where it's supposed to go, in a sense where it will make it to people. However, it will make it to people with the leaders taking control and taking credit for that money that's coming in, rather than it being an independent amount of money just there to help the people. So it would re-empower and re-legitimize the leaders that these people are trying to move aside.
And when we talk about aid from Canada, according to an investigation by Global News just last year, it said that aid sent to Syria, for example, was stolen by Al-Qaeda and those types of groups linked to Al-Qaeda. When you see this, are you confident that the aid will reach the people who actually need it?
In the case of Lebanon, I am confident that the aid will reach the people, especially if the aid is not, again, done through the state system. It will be quick, it will be fast. We have a lot of organizations who are very well established. They're all over the country, given our history of the Civil War. Amongst them is the Lebanese Red Cross. And they are really close to the people, and they will really be able to help the people. So I'm not concerned about these organizations siphoning off any of the money or using it for illegitimate means. I'm more concerned about legitimizing leaders that should not be legitimized and actors that should not be legitimized.
So what about the United Nations? UNICEF is largely focusing on aid around medical and vaccine supplies. Should money be given to these types of international bodies?
I think a mix of bodies is the right approach. However, we do have to also recognize that giving to UN organizations and large organizations includes a lot of administrative costs as well. So we cannot ignore the administrative cost aspect, whereas if you were to work with organizations on the ground, several organizations on the ground, there will be less of an administrative cost issue involved in the process. But absolutely, each one has a niche. It's a mix that we need to aim for, but a mix that, again, sends the most amount of money to the people that actually need it.
Yeah, and just on a personal note, I want to ask you, I understand your father actually survived that blast. How is he doing, and how has it been for you watching all of this unfold?
Well, my father was, I would believe, to be amongst the lucky ones. He actually left his office, which is at the port, a few minutes before the first explosion. He kept telling me something told him to leave, something told him to leave. In that same building, there are several bodies that have been found this morning, and several injured. He's devastated. His livelihood is practically gone. He has to restart. How we feel, I feel like most of the Lebanese community, that especially the people that I've been in touch with here, we feel guilty, we are angry, we're frustrated, we don't understand. For those of us who've lived through the Civil War, this still is something that we cannot fathom. Even though we've lived through a Civil War, we've seen the bombardments, we've even been, a part of them or injured by them for some of us, and we just can't understand. It just boggles our mind, and therefore we're extremely frustrated, but we are resilient and we want change. And we believe that we can get that change as long as people are given a fair chance to get the change that they want, and they're given a fair chance to implement a system that works for them, and that is not something that is dictated by either the elites or by others from the outside.
Ruby Dagger, I want to thank you for your insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you covering the story.
Ruby Dagger is a professor of international development at the University of Ottawa and joined us from Ottawa. You're watching CBC News Network. We're back in just a moment.